Hello, and welcome to the program today. Hope you all are doing well. My name is Michael Albrecht, your host, and today we're going to dive into an exploration of the US-Russian space race from the 1940s to the present. That space race involved a lot of competition as well as a lot of cooperation. Here's a cover from Time magazine in the 1950s describing that race between the Russians and the Americans to the moon. That race began in the late 1800s and into the 1900s with a variety of rocket scientists in various countries around the world. Primarily the Russian Tsiolkovsky and German Hermann Oberth. And of course, in the US, we had Robert Goddard. And all of these rocket scientists were developing new generations of rocketry involving new types of fuel and multi-stage propulsion systems. The United States government became interested in aeronautics and rocketry as early as 1915, when the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics, NACA, was founded. And there we see the first board of directors of NACA. Ultimately, decades later, the NACA would evolve into the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, founded by the Act of 1958. And here we see the headquarters in Washington, D.C. of what we now know as NASA. The Russians also had a very robust space program all through the 20th century, the mid to late 20th century. And the Russians, their program was spread out among the Soviet republics. And when the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s, the Russians consolidated their space program in this building in Moscow, under the name Roscosmos State Space Corporation. So here you have the two major leading Russian and American space companies, corporations, agencies. And the ultimate goal was, of course, to put a man on the moon. And this was finally achieved, of course, in July of 1969. And all of us remember the excitement of the 1960s, starting with Kennedy's announcement that in the early 60s that we were going to go to the moon. And that project developed all throughout the 60s under the direction of NASA. What's interesting is that toward the close of World War II, of course, the Germans had a very robust rocket program in the form of the V2 rocket that many of you may remember. And that program was headed in part by the German rocket scientist Wernher von Braun. And he was instrumental in developing the V2, or otherwise known as the Vengeance Weapon 2. And here is a photo of him with some of the German military Nazi leaders that he was working with. There's Wernher von Braun. What occurred, of course, toward the end of World War II is that the Soviets and the Americans went into Germany and retrieved German rocket scientists and equipment and blueprints. The V2 rocket, of course, had wreaked considerable devastation on southern England. Here is a scene of a library in London that had been hit by one of the V2 rockets. The V2 had new technology, of course, again, fuel and propulsion systems and guidance. At the end of the war, here we see May 8th, 1945. We see Winston Churchill there waving the V for victory sign over the crowds in London on Victory in Europe Day. And what happened was that at the end of the war, the Americans, the British, and the Soviets went into Germany to find as much information and equipment and so on that they could on the German rocket program. And the Americans were fortunate enough to obtain Wernher von Braun, here seen with US forces and a broken arm. Not quite sure how he got that. In July of 1945, just a couple of months after the end of World War II, there was the famous meeting of the leaders in Potsdam, Germany. And here's Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Stalin from Russia, meeting in Potsdam, Germany, and trying to iron out an agreement as to how the European theater would be structured. There were a lot of uncertainties left with that agreement, and therefore a lot of lingering suspicions and underlying conflict between the superpowers. So the US embarked upon a major program to bring as many of the German rocket scientists and equipment and blueprints and rocket designs to America to help develop our own rocket program. That was called Project Paperclip. Many of these points that I talk about today, you might want to make a note of, and you can Google them, such as the Project Paperclip, and find out a lot more in-depth information about that program. But here we see Wernher von Braun right here out in Fort Bliss, Texas, outside of El Paso. And scattered among this group are a number of German rocket scientists, along with American scientists and engineers as well. This is a photo taken in August of 1946 out in Fort Bliss, Texas. They were using the rocket site at White Sands, New Mexico, just north of Fort Bliss in southern New Mexico. And they developed a new generation, essentially, of the V2 rocket that they were going to use to spearhead the US space program. That rocket went up with a camera on it, and this photograph here is believed to be one of the first photos ever taken from suborbital flight above the Earth. And you can see here the curvature of the Earth with some clouds and land below it. So it's fascinating that we brought over German rocket scientists to help build the US space program. Here's a photo in Huntsville, Alabama. Wernher von Braun here had been transferred from Fort Bliss. Herman Olberth had come in, and they were the foundation of the US effort in Huntsville, Alabama, which still exists there at the Marshall Space Flight Center. President Harry Truman in the late 40s. He was kind of left in the dark about the Nazi affiliation of some of the German rocket scientists that were brought to the US. They thought that this would be a bit of a public relations problem, and so they kept Truman somewhat out of the loop as far as who the US officials were bringing in from Germany. Meanwhile, in Russia, they had, again, a very robust program. The General Vasily Vozniak headed their Russian rocket team here at the end of the war. And he brought in Sergei Korolev, the chief Russian rocket designer, who actually had been imprisoned by Joseph Stalin in the 1930s as a traitor to the Stalin regime. But when Stalin realized that Korolev was a brilliant rocket designer, he pulled him out of the Gulag and brought him into the work with the Russian space program. So here you see the foundations of the American and the Russian space programs that were supported heavily by Germans such as Helmut Gröttrup. He was a German rocket scientist who was brought in to the Russian program, just as we had brought in Hermann Oberth and Wernher von Braun. The Russians beat us to the punch in 1957 of getting the first satellite into orbit. And here we see a black and white photo taken actually at the Texas State Fair in October of 1947, and they're listening on a ham radio to the telltale signs of Sputnik in orbit around Earth. And here's the New York Times exclaiming the news to the world that the Russians had beat us to getting the first satellite into orbit. Both sides, the Americans and the Russians, had great successes early on, but they also had great failures. The Netherlands rocket disaster of October 24th, 1960. The Russians were experimenting with a liquid fuel that ignited on the launch pad during a test, and it killed nearly 200 rocket technicians and engineers and high-ranking officials, including Netherlands. And so that was a great setback for the Soviet space program. Still, they forged ahead, and the Soviets were able to put Yuri Gagarin into space. Some of you may remember that. In April of 1961, the first human to orbit Earth. Here's the headline in the Huntsville Times there at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center. So again, the Russians had beat us to orbit and the first man in orbit. And then also in June of 1963, the Russians put the first female into orbit, Valentina Tereshkova. It would be 20 years before the United States put a woman into orbit. The Russian workhorse rocket was the Vostok, which is still used today to lift human beings, both Russians, Americans, and other nationalities into orbit up to the International Space Station. In addition to Wernher von Braun and Hermann Oberth, the Americans also brought in from Germany, Dr. Kurt Debus, who became the first director of the Space Center at Cape Canaveral. And here we see a vintage photo of Debus here at the inauguration of what became Kennedy Space Center. And of course, there's John F. Kennedy here in 1962, inaugurating that Space Flight Center. The Russians continued forging ahead in the 1960s, putting the first human into orbit who walked in space. That was Alexei Leonov in March of 1965. The Americans followed suit a couple months later, putting astronaut Ed White into orbit above Earth. It's amazing to think of this astronaut flying along at about 17,000 miles an hour around Earth, about 200 miles up in orbit. Here he is tethered to the spacecraft. This would be a Gemini spacecraft at that time. And it must have been quite an adventure to be up there doing that. Meanwhile, the U.S. experienced its own series of failures on the launch pad, primarily, trying to launch the Mercury and the Gemini rockets. Fortunately, no one was lost in those failures. Here's von Braun now as a director of the Marshall Space Flight Center, and also another German brought in, Werner Dahm, who proved to be a very valuable rocket scientist and stayed with NASA for many decades. So it's very interesting, the overlap of cultures and technologies between the Germans and the Americans, and then the Germans and the Russians in our race to space. So a photograph of the original 7 Mercury astronauts, April 1959. And there you have all your famous characters, John Glenn and Gordon Cooper and Deke Slayton and Alan Shepard. Names you probably recognize, Gus Grissom. And so all of these astronauts went on to various levels of fame and fortune and tragedy in the case of Gus Grissom. Before we actually sent a human into orbit, NASA put a monkey into orbit, Ham, in January of 1961, just to make sure that a organism, primate, could go into orbit safely and return, which he did. Alan Shepard became the first American off the launch pad, and he did not quite orbit, but he did go up and land over in the Eastern Atlantic. So if you can see this little black capsule up here, that's where Alan Shepard was laying on his back as the rest of the rocket boosted him into a suborbital trajectory. Next was Gus Grissom. He was the second American in space in July of 1961 in Liberty Bell 7. And then John Glenn, of course, first Mercury astronaut to actually orbit Earth several times in February of 1962 in Friendship 7. John Glenn, of course, went on to become a senator from Ohio. So he had a very successful and interesting long life. John Kennedy, meanwhile, made his announcement in front of Congress in May of 1962 that we are going to the moon. Interestingly, here's Kennedy. In the background, you have 2 Texans, Lyndon Johnson, the vice president, and Sam Rayburn, the Speaker of the House. So a lot of interesting and rich history in American politics parallels the development of the U.S. space program. A second set of U.S. astronauts came to the fore here in September of 1962. More astronauts, many of them test pilots out of the Navy, the Air Force. And so both the Americans and the Russians were vigorously pursuing their space programs into the 60s, as both attempted to reach the moon first. And here is JFK at Rice University in Houston, Texas, on September of 1963, making the announcement to the country and the world that we will go to the moon, not because it is easy, but because it is difficult. I'm sure some of you may remember that speech. The first Gemini launch included Gus Grissom and John Young. And John Young went on to also pilot the US Space Shuttle. So these were this moved from the Mercury program into the Gemini program in mid 1960s. And again, you can see up here the capsule, the spacecraft that both these astronauts were laying in on their backs as the rocket boosted them into orbit. Of course, when that rocket goes up, it's pushing those astronauts against the back of their seats with multiple G's of force. So it must be quite an experience. Here's a photo of LBJ with Gemini 4 astronauts at the Houston Space Center, what would become the Johnson Space Center, of course, circa 1965. Johnson was instrumental in the development of the US space program. He saw the handwriting on the wall that the Russians were mounting an effort to get to the moon and to become establish a superior presence in orbit around Earth, which Johnson realized would give them a tactical and strategic advantage over the US. So he was very keen to develop the US space program, driving force behind it. Here is an aerial photo of the fabled Cape Canaveral in the 1960s and 70s with a whole series of launch pads here from which NASA was launching the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions, and then later the Space Shuttle. And now, as we know, more private enterprises, the SpaceX's, are going up from Cape Canaveral as well. Here's a very wonderful photo of Wernher von Braun here in the 60s watching a test flight of the Saturn V rocket, which was a heavy lift rocket designed specifically to carry astronauts and equipment to the moon. So here you can see the Atlantic coast, the Atlantic Ocean on the Florida coast. And you can see all these rocket engineers at NASA watching this test flight. And so very exciting times that we lived through. A major setback occurred, of course, in January of 1967 with the Apollo 1 fire that killed astronauts Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee. I'm sure some of you remember that. Meanwhile, in fact, on the very same day of that tragedy, January 27, 1967, the US signed an outer space treaty with all the major nations of the world, including Russia and Britain, the French, and so on. This treaty was designed to ensure that the use of space would be for non-military purposes and would be for science and research and technology, that nations would be open and transparent about their operations, and if there were any problems or issues, that all the nations would cooperate to resolve them. So this was a good step forward, the Outer Space Treaty, which actually would be used and up until recent times to establish a subsequent treaty. The Russians, meanwhile, suffered another setback to their program when Vladimir Komarov died in a crash in April of 1967 when his parachute failed to deploy when he was coming back to the Soviet landing site in Kazakhstan. Unlike the Americans who splashed down in the ocean, the Soviets have always hard landed on the Kazakhstan steppes in one of the former Soviet republics. And so they have had some tragedies there. Moving ahead with the US program in December of 1968, Apollo 8 went to the moon, went out there and basically orbited the moon as a test run. Here is the Apollo craft on its way to the launch pad. And again, up at the top of the rocket there, you can see the actual spacecraft, the capsule, as it were. And below it are the stages that carry the equipment. And further down here, of course, is all the fuel, the sections of the rocket, various stages that carry the fuel that will propel the spacecraft itself into orbit. So this was a very exciting time. Here's a rather vintage diagram showing the Apollo 8 flight plan, the lunar orbital profile, the launch from Florida and going around Earth once and then slingshotting off to the moon. And it took 3 days for them to get to the moon. They went around the moon once and then 3 days back to Earth and then splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. So very exciting times that we all lived through in the 1960s. In December, on Christmas Eve 1968, we saw the first Earthrise image ever photographed when the astronauts came around and saw Earth rising above the surface, the horizon of the moon. So about 6 months later, Apollo 11 launched at Cape Canaveral with the 3 astronauts and took 3 days to get to the moon. And again, here we see the spacecraft up at the top with the 3 astronauts in it. There it is way up top there. This will have the lunar lander and the rover, the propellant, the fuel that would boost them into orbit. So just an incredible technological achievement for the United States. And of course, built upon German rocketry know-how. So it was certainly a collaborative event. And here's the Apollo 11 crew. Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. Armstrong and Aldrin would descend from the spacecraft, land on the moon, and walk on the moon. Michael Collins would stay in the command module while the 2 descended and returned. So I'm sure many of you were watching this somewhere in the world on July 20, 1969. And let's take a moment and view a brief video of that liftoff and moon landing. Walter Cronkite. Is it? Well, isn't that wonderful? It still chokes me up after all these years. I hope you enjoyed that little video clip and brought back some memories of where you were at that time. And I know we're all proud as Americans and as human beings to have been a part in some form of that, even as just taxpayers helping fund that effort. Just an incredible achievement, milestone for humanity to have lived through. So that's just so exciting. Here's a diagram showing the the six landing sites of the various Apollos from 1969 to 1972. Apollo 11, 12, 13, of course, blew a oxygen tank and didn't make it. They went to the moon and returned. 14, 15, 16, and 17. So when we look at the full moon these days, we can still look up at the sites where the American astronauts landed in that era. And of course, it looks like we're going to return to the moon in the 2020s here. I understand that actually the Russians and the Chinese have recently signed an agreement that they're going to go to the moon for the first time and set up a research laboratory. So that's really exciting. And the Americans, of course, have a plan to return to the moon also. So it won't be too long till there'll be strip malls and McDonald's up on the moon for our great-great-grandchildren. And it'll probably be routine to go in a spacecraft and spend a weekend or a honeymoon on the moon. But that's a little ways down the road. Here's a picture of Buzz Aldrin on the moon, taken by Neil Armstrong. And you can actually see Neil in the visor reflected here. And what an incredible experience that must have been to walk around on the moon and look back at Earth. Moving along in that series of launches and landings on the moon, Apollo 15 in August 1971, they went up there. They actually drove a buggy around on the moon. And so whoever returns to the moon will find some of this equipment and this American flag still up there. You can see the footsteps in the lunar dust soil there. And so a lot still to be done. Here's a view that Apollo 15 had in July of 1971, returning to the Earth. And the last mission to land on the moon was Apollo 17 in December of 1972. And there's a wonderful photo they got looking at the continent of Africa here and Antarctica down here. It's very amazing to be able to look down on Earth from space, see the Red Sea, Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, and Europe are up here around the corner. You can actually tell what season this is. You can tell that it's December or winter because the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the sun, and the southern hemisphere, including Antarctica, are in full sun for a number of months. So that's a very descriptive photograph. Here's the plaque that Apollo 17 left on the moon, designating that here man completed his first exploration of the moon in December of 1972. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind. So a real nice sentiment that we left up there on this plaque, and it'll be pretty exciting for someone, future astronauts who land up there, to go up and find that. The Soviets were continuing their efforts to get into space. They had encountered another disaster in June of '71 when they lost these 3 cosmonauts. And when there was a valve or a leak in their spacecraft as they were returning to Earth, and the oxygen was sucked out of the spacecraft, and all 3 of these brave cosmonauts died, sadly and tragically. But the Soviets continued their efforts. In 1971, they had a new cosmonaut group formed. Meanwhile, the US was forging ahead with Skylab and putting the first space station, American space station, in orbit, conducting science experiments. And you can see the solar panels here that are helping, that are gathering light from the sun and helping power the equipment and lab work on the Skylab here, where they were living and doing experiments. And again, here you are, some 150 to 200 miles above the surface of the Earth. You're traveling along at about 17,500 miles an hour, which means you go around the Earth in about 90 minutes. So it's a whole different world up there in orbit. You can see how thin the bulk of the atmosphere is on Earth. You can see this very thin blue line, which extends about 50 miles from the surface of Earth out into space. So the bulk of our atmosphere is only about 50 miles. Some have likened the atmosphere to a membrane around an egg. And indeed, for 150, 200 years now, we've been pumping a lot of exhausts and pollutants into the air as we have fueled our modern civilization. And so we're now encountering some of the greenhouse effects of putting so much carbon into the atmosphere. It's causing the heat from the sun to stay in the atmosphere and not radiate back out. So that's causing significant trouble for warming of the atmosphere and the oceans, which is a whole nother topic, which NASA is exploring and investigating. In July of 1975, the Americans and the Soviets collaborated on the Apollo-Soyuz test project, where we met in space. They shot up one of their rockets, and we shot up one of ours, and we met and docked. We had, of course, designed the equipment so we could dock with each other. And here are the 5 astronauts that were involved with that. The famous American astronauts, Deke Slayton, who later became a director of NASA, and Vance Brand and Stafford here. So these are the 3 Americans. And then you have, I think, Alexei Leonov and one other Russian cosmonaut there. So that was a great milestone of international cooperation between the superpowers and between former Cold War adversaries now collaborating in space. So it really is great to see that we often will find where the politicians may not be agreeing, science is continuing to work and collaborate. So I have a lot of faith and hope in science and the scientists and the engineers to keep things going in the right direction, even while politicians argue over policy. So the U.S. space program launched the Space Shuttle in 1981. And I'm sure many of you remember this, the launch of the first space shuttle in April. Seems like there's a lot of activity in April throughout the space race and the space program in both countries. The first female astronaut, Sally Ride, in 1983, went into orbit on the Space Shuttle Transport System 7. And there's Sally Ride, who was a longtime American astronaut. The Space Shuttle Discovery here with the US-Russian crew. So again, we're moving from an era of competition into an era of cooperation and collaboration between the Americans and the Russians.
Booster ignition and liftoff of Discovery on a bold new era of spaceflight between the United States and Russia.
See a little video clip here of activity in orbit. Science experiments, physiology, photography. Well, there you go. So again, you know, we came out of the Cold War as adversaries and at times at each other's throats with nuclear weapons, and now here we are cooperating in space. So it's good to see the countries hanging in there and moving from an era of conflict into an era of cooperation. The Russians, meanwhile, had sent up their own space station, the MIR, which stands for peace, in February of 1986. And this is a launch clip that we'll see here in March of 1995.
That is making his first ride into space. The language has come along fine, and at this point, I wouldn't say that's a big barrier. I think we can do it, and indeed, given the cost of these projects these days, I think that's what we will do in the future, both space exploration of the moon and moving out the planets.
So there you go, collaboration in orbit. There's the MIR Space Station orbiting the Earth, again with its many solar panels that are powering the equipment and the lab gear. You can see the beautiful planet Earth in the background. Of course, Earth is hurtling along around the sun at about 67,000 miles an hour as the sun itself is moving around the outer part of the galaxy at about 500,000 miles an hour. So you've got a lot of speeds and trajectories at play here while the human beings are taking their first steps off of the planet. So the U.S. space program, of course, lasted for about 20 years. About 30 years from 1981 to 2011. And we saw a lot of milestones occur there. There was a joint statement of cooperation in space signed in 1987, which laid the groundwork for Russian US docking between the MIR Space Station and our shuttles. So we're continuing to cooperate and collaborate in orbit.
It was a flight where there was a high degree of congressional interest because of the risk. There were questions about the Russian MIR space station that had the fire. Previously, they had the collision. And then a couple of days before liftoff, the MIR experienced another attitude control computer failure, and so they lost attitude control. So there were a lot of questions that we had to answer prior to liftoff regarding whether or not it was safe to go up the MIR.
And there you hear it from a NASA spokesman. The difficulties in space continued with the programs. I'm sure you all remember the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, January 28th of 1968. We lost 7 astronauts when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded just a minute or so after launch. The space station has been continuously inhabited for about 20 years now, 21 years. The US and Russians and many other nationalities have been on the space station. You can see the International Space Station fly overhead over wherever you happen to be on Earth several times a month for a period of several days at a time. The space station passes overhead and about the speed of a satellite, and you can see the sun reflecting off of it. And so there are websites where you can track where those are, when it will be visible in your sky. Continued collaboration on the International Space Station. The US suffered another loss of the Challenger in February of 2003. After the Space Shuttle program ended, NASA actually contracted with the Russians to ferry our astronauts into space. And they did that for about 9 years until recently. Here we see International Space Station astronauts and cosmonauts working in orbit while moving along at 17,500 miles an hour. In 2020, astronaut Christina Koch ended a record stay in orbit for an American female, 328 days. And here are American astronauts on the launch pad in Baikonur in Kazakhstan, about to go up on one of the Russian Soyuz spacecraft. And again, the Russians, they hard land on the Kazakhstan platforms there. They come down with a parachute, and then they all run out and retrieve them. Here's a US astronaut being carried away from the Soyuz spacecraft. And after you've been in orbit for many months, you're kind of weak, and you need to be handled with care, as you can see here. More collaboration. Americans and Russians in orbit. We're going to wrap up the program today talking about the new era of space activity that's occurring in America, especially with the SpaceX. It's the privatization of the US space program. And SpaceX, run by a gentleman named Elon Musk. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He's quite a character. And SpaceX on May 30th of 2020 launched 3 astronauts into orbit into the International Space Station. So there are a number of private enterprises that are looking to establish themselves in orbit and to the moon. Elon Musk wants to take America not only to the moon, but to Mars, and believes he can do that by the middle of this decade. SpaceX splashes down in the Gulf of Mexico. And here's that craft coming in with the astronauts last May, and they're getting ready to shoot another one up here soon. Meanwhile, NASA is developing a new heavy launch system called the Space Launch System, SLS, which will take astronauts to the moon and Mars. So NASA is collaborating with SpaceX and other private companies. There's always been private contractors, of course. The Russians, meanwhile, have a new generation of space station coming online, the OPSEC, that's in the planning stages still. That'll be the next generation International Space Station. Recently, a new treaty has been signed, Artemis Accords, for planetary and space exploration. And so the collaboration and cooperation seems to have won out over the competition, competitive nature between the Americans and the Russians. And so we're going to continue moving into the 21st century as human beings have finally gotten off of the planet and are moving out into the solar system. And a famous old Latin saying, per aspera ad astra, through hardship to the stars, captures the essence of the human desire to get off the planet and back out into space. The American astronomer Carl Sagan is famous for saying that we are made of star stuff, that the chemicals and the atoms in our body were forged in previous generations of stars. And so we are now star stuff, looking back out at the universe and now traveling back out. So we have been privileged and honored to live through the early stages of human exploration in space, which was fueled by the competition between the Russians and the Americans, which has now evolved into cooperation and collaboration. So it's been a very exciting life to have lived and seen all this unfold before our eyes. I'm honored to be able to talk with you about it today, and hope you've enjoyed this program, and look forward to future programs in the near future. So hope you all are well, take care, and I'll be in touch. Michael Albrecht signing off. Bye-bye.